Hello everyone and welcome to our latest webinar. Your presenter for today's webinar is Ben Edwards, our SVP of Business Development. Before we run through today's webinar, I just want to touch on a few housekeeping items. Firstly, if you do have any audio issues, please let us know by messaging us in the chat box. Secondly, we're recording this webinar and be sharing the link with you following today's session so you can share it with your colleagues. Finally, we welcome any questions you may have throughout the webinar, so feel free to use the chat box to ask any questions. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Ben to get us underway.
Thank you, Sean. Hello, everybody. As Sean said, I'm Ben. I'm the SVP of Business Development, and what that really means is that I get to work with a number of key clients, some of whom are on the webinar today, which is great, and also see a number of potential PageSuite publishers across the world. I get to listen to all of their and your business challenges and figure out how to better monetize digital and app solutions. So in this webinar, we will be covering a little introduction, so what's happening across newspapers, consumer and B2B magazines, and we'll be having a look at investments and venture capital and how that's impacted publishing, or how publishers are impacting that. We'll take a look at how to grow revenues outside of content, so large scale events, exhibitions and tours, and we'll also be touching on e-commerce. Branded and native content, more as a service, is interesting, and though the end product is actually content, we're finding with native advertising from publishers' own studios, it tends to be more around campaigns and influence. So rather than journalists creating copied or imagery or videos and then selling via subscription in either print or digital, it's a new way to drive digital revenues. We'll also be covering distribution and extensions. And although that touches upon utilizing content, it's very much about identifying opportunities outside of the conventional. So not about getting into retailers or selling subscriptions. There are many more business models in play here. Then we're looking at subscription drivers, the marketing 4Ps, so product, pricing, promotion, and place. So even if you aren't creating content or creating more content, how can you as marketeers or sales people deliver better revenues for the business? The final two, if we have time, so attracting new audiences and retention tools and products, admittedly are heavily content related. A little bit against the webinar title, but as with all of our webinars, our research has brought up some really interesting ideas which could be of inspiration or spark an opportunity for you. So if we have time, we'll be covering those before the Q&A. Okay, so first off, we're going to cover off a little overview of what's been happening. So GDPR, it's actually had little impact on advertising, and that's unfortunate really, because a number of publishers who we spoke to hope that this would mean that programmatic sales were a little less trusted, and that coming direct for advertising straight to the publisher would mean an increase in revenues. Obviously, you could charge higher CPMs if you're dealing direct with an advertiser. That unfortunately hasn't been the case, and it's done nothing really to stop the flow and decreasing of advertising revenue opportunities that publishers have. The positive is, from a publishing perspective, increasingly there is a look to paywalls, and readers are becoming more accustomed to paying for content. Started off probably with paid TV, then brands like Spotify and music, and also now news. And slowly but surely we're seeing trusted news brands move that way, as you can see from some of the graphics on the right hand side. In recent months, we've seen CNN, Business Insider, The Atlantic and Wired all declare or move their intentions to paid for digital content. And that bodes well, because in amongst recent studies, there's been an increasing acceptance to pay for news. In fact, in Australia, they had the highest year-on-year growth, with a 7% year-on-year increase in acceptance to pay for news, with Norway, Sweden and Finland marginally behind, and already starting from a very high base. There is a big spread between people's willingness to pay for news. At the top, you've got Norway and other Scandinavian markets with over 30% of the population willing to pay, and more towards the bottom, where we are here in the UK, only at 7%. But from the Reuters Institute reports and others, other market evaluation, we are seeing that slowly but surely increase year on year. Quality journalism is now a core and a key part of the marketing message, as publishers realise that the way to sustain their models and have regular recurring revenues based on subscription is to promote that message to their customers, so that the readers actually buy into the higher quality that is being produced compared to social media partners. Consumer consciousness is important. If we take Spain and Portugal, for example, where there hasn't just been a culture of free content on the web, but years years of reading free printed papers in coffee shops, having that transition to paying for anything, let alone something as intangible as digital, is going to be tough. Interestingly, there are still tweaks of subscription products happening. So here in the UK, the Telegraph, a premium meter on their website, started at putting around 30% of their content behind a paywall. Now it's up to 60%, and they've actually locked down whole sections like politics and rugby. And obviously with the data they've got and the conversion metrics in play, they're able to identify how certain sections and types of content pull people down the funnel to improve that. News Corp in Australia have softened their paywall for ex-subscribers. So even though some people have stopped paying, they continually market to them and then offer them limited access. Again, probably because they've got the data that shows in the hope and expectation they re-engage and start to pay. It's much simpler for bigger news organizations, some I've cited there. For instance, the director of audience development in the New York Times said the execs in that business only took notice of the paywall when they hit 1 million, which is a number way in excess of what any of us could ever dream of in either smaller nations or more regional publishing and even magazines. Donations and membership have been interesting too. The University of Oxford study of 180 digital leaders across 29 countries showed that 52% cited subscriptions as their number one focus. Donations and membership was at 7%. So although that's lower, that does show the increasing impact that brands like Guardian and Wikipedia have had on that business model. I touched on it earlier, but advertising declines are still apparent in newspapers and magazines. The good news from a B2B perspective is for those brands, because it's not as commoditized as news and consumer, it hasn't been impacted quite so detrimentally. They're not being hammered quite in the same way by media buyers as you have through Google and Facebook for news and B2C brands. And the trusted nature and the quality content and the audience value is holding up firm in B2B. In fact, I was on a meeting this week where they were so successful with their digital advertising at generating leads for their advertisers, they were able to generate over $50 CPMs, which for them is obviously great news. The whole point of this webinar really is around diversifying your revenues. A lot of our content that we cover and the meetings that we have talk about subscriptions and advertising, which obviously is a key focus. But like other massively disrupted industries like film and music, we've got to look at other ways to drive revenue. So they, for instance, have moved into events, e-commerce, entertainment, venues, and even Disney recently into platforms themselves. Publishers need to find small pots that might only be 5 to 10% of your total revenues, but offer you some of those healthy margins that you used to have in the 90s and the thousands. From the meetings we have and the clients we talk to, I'm of the strong belief that mindset and positivity actually goes a long way when looking at those publishers that survive versus those publishers that die. Investment vehicles. So one really interesting thing that when we were coming through and doing the research on this webinar that became apparent is that media companies have long been investing in a variety of different businesses, but the scale and the breadth of which is something that essentially we wanted to bring to you because there are some really interesting pieces in here. So Schibsted first, their CEO was at INMA last month in New York, and she was talking about their IPO of their classified business, Adavinta. It was the largest Norwegian IPO in 13 years and generated $6 billion at IPO. In fact, I just checked earlier, and it's up 10% in the last 2 months anyway. So they obviously got that price point right. And there she was talking about how for Schibsted, they're now operating their businesses in 3 silos. They've got digital growth businesses they could spin out, like Adavinta, and achieving high valuations. Then they've got their second, which is the core. It's declining, but still very profitable news business. And then the third is actually acting as an incubator for very small businesses and startups, which then benefit from the 2 other silos, the expertise in terms of the digital growth silo, or the reach in terms of the news brands. Now, obviously, as an incubator, the success and failure rates are much more varied, but they believe in this as a strategy long term. Australian media firms have been really savvy. So 2 biggest there, Fairfax and News Corp, have very successfully retained a financial interest in large retail classified brands whilst pocketing big returns when they listed them on the Aussie stock market several years ago. So REA spun off from News Corp, and Domain came from Fairfax, which for those in the UK and the US who have heard of Rightmove, it's very, very similar type of brand to that. So it's an online real estate classified portal. Axel Springer have got some interesting investments too. And we dug into where they previously invested, and they've got some really successful ones. And I'm sure we'll have benefited from Uber's recent IPO as a stakeholder there, and will do so when Airbnb do as well. They're also a big investor in Purple Bricks, which is an online estate agency. So it's not as like for like classified revenue replacement as the Australians, but it obviously is a service they feel they can scale globally. They've also just put some money into Magic Leap, which is a very future focused investment, and it's all around wearable augmented reality hardware and software. We then move on to Bertelsmann, who are the owners of Gruner & Jahr, which is a big German magazine group, and they have other media brands in their portfolio, and their investments are much more media centric. So they've just put some money last year into 2 US digital first content brands, which are Flow Sports and Athletic, which are both really good reads. And they also invest in the technology side of the media industry. So they've got an investment in TiVo, which is a little bit like Polar or Outbrain or Taboola, if you've heard of those as well. And occasionally they've got investments that align maybe with their corporate strategy. So they've got an investment in an e-commerce clothing brand called Frank and Oak, which is like ethical clothing brand. Thank you, Sean. Sorry. Now, there haven't all been crunch-based successes. In fact, Warner have closed their venture capital arm, even after making some successful exits, including selling Maker Studios to Disney for $600 million. They did make some losses on brands like Mashable and Refinery 29, but to us, the closure seems to be more of a strategic element where Warner are refining the departments they have more than performance-based, because overall they seem to have had some good successes. Other failures include NBC's $200 million investment in BuzzFeed at a then valuation of $1.7 billion, which is decreased dramatically. And then some lesser known ones, so Comcast with Vox and New York Times investments in brands like AppSavvy, which we couldn't find huge returns or in fact any returns on. Now, the final piece on the investment vehicle slide is on new media. So Snapchat themselves actually IPOing. What they do is they're making $150,000 investments in 10 smaller media firms. That's a very similar business model to the most successful early stage venture capital business, Y Combinator. Y Combinator is a San Francisco based firm who, again, at $150,000 investment, take a 7% stake in firms, and they've made 2,000 investments over the years. The really staggering thing, I can see why Snap are interested in this type of model, is 93 of those 2,000 are now each worth over $100 million. And in total, all of their investments are worth $100 billion. So Snapchat obviously want a piece of that pie, and having come from that world of West Coast and IPOing, they obviously feel confident to do so. Okay, utilizing events. So again, touching on an earlier point, which was having 5 or 6 revenue pots. The Atlantic started with nothing in their events business, but over the last decade have built it up year on year to a point where it now represents 20% of their overall revenues, which is a solid performance. And although the effort and intent to create 125 events a year is by no means a small feat, they've obviously done it with the future in mind, understanding that print revenues, both from subscription and advertising, would decline, and they had to fill that pot up from somewhere else. I've always felt that consumer brands could do more with their audience and community anyway, and particularly lucrative ones like Condé Nast with some of their fashion, and in this case, their wedding markets. They've actually experienced a 25% year-on-year increase in the Indian market for their wedding event business, which for anyone who's got married will know is very, very lucrative, and they've actually put their stamp down and made a good fist of it, and that year-on-year increase is probably very well received considering their print declines. Time Out, another traditional print brand, but have very successfully pivoted, and they've got a market in Lisbon, and it's a maximization of their brand and community. I talk about it a fair bit, but the food, the drink, the experience in their halls is such a great physical use of their brand. It's one that really can't be ignored. Supporting that, they do an additional 800 events a year, huge number of attendees, big driver for ticketing and sponsorship revenues. So again, that print brand is probably still supporting a large chunk, but they've really successfully pivoted with a couple of other innovations. On a more smaller local level, events in offices are increasingly popular. Guardian use their free podcast as a way to build an audience and then pitch, sell, market to them to come into the Guardian offices for a fee and listen to the podcasters in person. Subscribers get a priority, they get discounted access, and other magazine and newspapers will do something similar in an audience with type manner. An example here on the slide is the Boris Johnson event with Telegraph a couple of months ago. And I've actually heard the Times, as part of their subscription funnel, have identified that the final stage to absolutely reduce retention to over 90% is to get somebody to an event. So it really is for the most engaged of your users. We've also got publishers who've invited people in to meet and discuss with the editors or the journalists around a certain topic. I've seen it very well done in the States with topics around Trump and politics. That's a really great way to get subscribers feeling engaged and also literally giving them probably what they asked for. New York Times have conference calls for subscribers to dial in and listen to conversations between journalists to get inside information on hot topics and coverage. You've also got the Skim, another US brand, but I really like this, relatively new brand from what I could tell, but they've got a really diversified revenue model, obviously from the fact that they don't have a reliance on any print product from what I can tell. So they are, very heavily invested in digital. They've got some great pieces of sponsored content, obviously work really hard with the brands on that. And they then have really good podcasts, and they've got a really personal, relatable feel. The end result really, from what I can see from a revenue driver, is that's driving event participation. So I went on their website and they've got 15, 20 cities listed where the Skim team visit and hold in-person events. Pretty much all of them are sold out. And the other nice thing I saw, which was a good idea, is the journalists made a really good brand for themselves, and the editors front and center of it. They've written books, and then at those events, which they're charging for, they then charge more to actually sell the books and additional upsell opportunities for the signings. We were at INMA last month, I think it was, in New York, and the big 3 prize winners in the events category were all around focusing on youth engagement. So Independent in South Africa won with their national high school quiz, which sounded really cool. And another good one that I wanted to bring to people's attention was Gannett's High School Sports Awards. And to me, that was just a brilliant play for all of the 3 stakeholder groups involved. So for the newspapers, it was a great way to get their brand out there, possibly an opportunity to promote their subscription opportunities to the future generations, and indeed generate revenue from the sponsors. Great for the sponsors because collegiate sport in America is huge, probably a really important part of their business going forwards, identifying future talent, getting them signed up. And obviously for the attendees, it's a life-changing moment, opportunity to win an award, and again, maybe an opportunity to interact with a traditional masthead brand they never would have done. E-commerce. So the top 2, BuzzFeed and Meredith, they're generating e-commerce revenue from commissions. So with the amount of review type content that they produce, so it's content around what are the top 10 styles, what are this season's must have, what should you buy on Father's Day, all of that type of content, you're putting retail opportunities actually within the review. And obviously with the consumer brands, you're in a great place because you've driven an audience to that. And with data and analytics, you're in a fantastic place to track and monetize it through the chain when the clicks actually come through to an e-commerce provider's website. It's quite a simple business model, but obviously great referral revenues being generated there. Taking that step a bit further, there's Hearst have got Men's Health, and in the FMCG market have created their own food and supplements, which makes sense given their type of audience and the audience propensity to want to buy more healthy products. And in a similar manner, Good Housekeeping has launched a homeware product with a US retailer using that e-commerce platform as well. One really good example of a massively realized digital investment is actually here in the UK. It isn't a print or a digital magazine, but to us shows how to harness a brand and an audience. And that's the Buy a Car website from Dennis. It started off generating £400,000 in 2014, and it's now up to around £60 million worth of revenue. And their CEO actually said in the next year or 2, he wants that over £100 million. Obviously generating a huge amount of car sales from that, all based on the review-based content. Dennis is a relatively large consumer magazine publisher, yet this single brand now represents 40% of all of its revenues. Kiosks are also interesting. Publishers looking at bundling content into a Netflix style all-you-can-eat products and monthly fee. We've seen success in terms of selling it to consumers, but the other angle, which is interesting and publishers probably could do more of, is where you white label that kiosk product and allow third-party customers access. So i.e. you partner with a utility firm, an energy firm, maybe a transport business, and they pay you fees to allow their customers access because they're offering it as a value add to their own service. Now, you do need scale and breadth of content, but we have seen it successfully done in different markets. The final one on the e-commerce side is Washington Post. They've built a B2B business with their Arc CMS. Media firms in the past have tried this, some successfully, some unsuccessfully, but obviously with Bezos at the helm, they're really pushing for this. And actually, other media firms could well have built or even paid development businesses like us to create other tech products that might have a resellable, reskinnable, licensable element to other businesses going forwards. Branded content. So syndication is an area of good growth. I was on LinkedIn last week and actually got my reference point for this, which was good. I saw one of our clients, Racing Post, they had been advertising their bloodstock and consumer content, I presumed, to bookmakers. That makes really good sense. There's national brands who I've talked to recently who are selling their match day sports coverage, and magazine publishers selling recipes, reviews, and other content and such across the world. Sponsored content over display has got to be a focus as well, particularly with display advertising still for newspapers and consumer magazines dropping significantly. The best, a really good case study I found was Metro Belgium. They launched Metro Start as a brand, and it's a way for recruiters, instead of using the traditional classified advertising spots, but to use storytelling as a way to engage with candidates. So the recruiter actually sells their dream job in Metro Start in the weekly section on a Monday, which is when most people look for a new job. They signed up 68 new clients this year, and did 880 pieces of new content compared to just 330 in 2015. So a really good example of how sponsored content can come into play rather than just a traditional display ad. The other interesting angle is the number of brand or studio launches that we've seen. Beano have leaned on their heritage in building kids content communities so that children's brands can tap into that expertise. On the B2B side, you've got more niche, but American Chemical Society realize advertisers need their expertise because they're a little bit behind the curve, and the society's got all of this expertise and journalists creating fantastic marketing opportunity content, video content, all around things chemical, and it adds some credibility for the advertisers if they want to post stuff on their own website or white papers or what have you. Lots of major developed markets, main brands also have their own studios as well. I've put a few here that if you want to delve into, you can look at. So News UK, New York Times, USA Today, Reuters, South China Morning Post, and News Corp in Australia's DNA agency all do content marketing work as well. Market research is an interesting extension too. So there's magazine publishers targeting certain communities, and advertisers don't just want the display advertising from them. So that magazine publisher actually conducts surveys and research to give the brands the insight into what makes their audience tick. Video production, we've heard how publishers create video content for themselves so that they can drive traffic to their website or in their apps as a piece of content that subscribers or readers will engage with. And as an afterthought, I've then had the opportunity where the brand who's in those videos is actually asked to have that video content themselves, because they either don't have the technical capabilities in the first place to create it, they don't have the expertise around it, and certainly they don't have the voice and the brand recognition that the publisher does. And it adds some level of credibility to the story or whatever content is on that video. And it's particularly relevant in the B2B space and regional publishing. I think given regionals are really suffering, branded content is an obvious move to negate the advertising revenue declines, particularly because the businesses are further behind the digital curve than more national or international brands, and regional publishers have an opportunity to tap into that. It's always difficult for publishers to push PR and newswires as a solution, because you don't want your own content to be flooded with PR. It's got a detrimental effect on the quality control. But certainly the in-house expertise and reach that publishers have lends itself really nicely to agency work. How you badge that is the difficulty. The latest hot thing, so VR, AR, podcasts, whatever the latest hot thing is an opportunity for branded content, particularly around a specific campaign. Now, it might only be a short-term win, but over the years, because we've been in tech for about 12 or 13, we've seen everything come and go. We've seen smartwatch, VR, AR, interactive microsites. Those represent revenue opportunities because the brands to your typical advertisers, some of those will want to appear innovative. They'll want to be first to market. They'll want to be the first one to have an interactive advert use AR and VR in a particular way. There is nothing wrong with capitalizing on a small tactical opportunity, even if you don't believe in it long term, because it's revenue. The final piece is international licensing. So examples like Forbes through to OK magazines. There's so many examples of where publishers have driven revenue this way. What's interesting and what I wanted to highlight is actually now with countries' populations changing and having really diverse cultures and residents within it, all from different communities and backgrounds, publishers might actually have a revenue opportunity selling the international created license editions back into the local markets rather than the traditional way, which is vice versa. So if we're honest, native content, helping advertisers better communicate with audiences, utilizing market research, these are also great ways that publishers can gain and retain advertisers. So distribution and extensions. Apple News Plus is launching in the UK soon, having already launched in the US. Now, they haven't revealed the revenue splits to anybody in the UK that we've spoken to, but there are some details floating around in the US. And we've heard that it's quite a high engagement product, and certainly more so than instant articles or the Google AMP product. Newspaper and magazine brands tend to be much more front and center in Apple News Plus than any other ones. Apple have obviously really heavily focused on putting content which is already premium behind the Plus product to sort of justify the monthly fee, and that's as part of the purchase of texture that obviously see them acquire a certain number of deals. So that will be interesting. Google and Facebook, the digital duopoly, first click free has diminished, bent, buckled, realized. So that's happening. Instant articles diminishing, probably because it's not been as successful as they wanted. So that's some first steps from those two. And there is a feeling now amongst some people in the media that they are starting to recognize the importance of regional, national magazine brands. Certainly when you look at Google's $4 billion worth of advertising revenue from publishers, it'd be silly not to ignore it. So they're starting to recognize and support and work closely with publishers with funding initiatives, mainly around subscriptions, but we want to see more of that. And that's a revenue opportunity for publishers as well, obviously. There are several kiosks still around. Interesting to see for how long, because as publishers look at their own, and then with Apple News, I think I'm just putting a watching brief on that, but there are publishers who generate some decent revenue from those. In some markets, particularly in Scandinavia, the library and higher education distribution revenues have proven useful too. So there have been big drives in Finland and Sweden and Norway, for instance, to digitize publishers' archives to allow their citizens broader access. Now, that liberal thinking is excellent. Unfortunately, for those of us in parts of the world where the government or the policy funding doesn't drive it forwards, it's almost certainly not going to happen. But in those markets where it has, really good revenue uptick for them, and obviously a good opportunity to maximize all of that fantastic archive content that publishers hold. Reformatting is providing a challenge, but all three of these audio vehicles podcasts are increasingly talked about. Taking audio, so Alexa and Google Home, for instance, with the use cases around morning briefings for publishers. That's either going to be a brand acquisition tool or a sponsored content play because there's no listener revenues. Vehicles is interesting too. So whether those are self-driving cars or connected with CarPlay, this concept seems far off, but publishers say they feel like this could be an opportunity for publishers to get back in the forefront and potentially through a collaborative style effort. And obviously with Apple News Plus being a paid for piece of collaborative news media engagement, maybe that's the way forwards, and maybe they will harness the opportunities in vehicles going forwards, and being part of that will play to publishers' advantage because hopefully there's a decent revenue share there. Podcast, the volume has increased dramatically. Bertelsmann, one of the brands I talked about earlier, has invested in Wondery. They've got a storytelling platform that has promoted pods like The Dirty John, which is a really popular podcast. There's Acast too, and they've got a premium offering at $1.99 a month, but that's hardly stellar revenue. And I again would look at brands like Spotify and Tidal on the audio scene with their huge back catalogue of content, but still not making much, well, no profit, I believe. And the revenues, although driving high valuations, does lead some people to call into question how fantastic a revenue opportunity podcast will be long term. Is again maybe one of the ones to have on a watching brief to explore and dabble, and if you can use it from a sponsored content perspective or to drive audience engagement, then that is of value. On the timelessness and the nostalgia perspective, regularly talked about is New York Times crosswords, because they do make a couple of $1 million revenue a year from this. And even in our replica solution, and indeed in the interactive versions in our apps, they are absolutely sacrosanct. If you move, touch, adjust, edit, anything to do with crosswords, readers will come down on you like a ton of bricks. So it shows that it's still a really important part of most newsprint's armory. Food is another interesting one, again referencing New York Times, but they've been really successful driving subscriptions, upselling their traditional $15 a month price point by an additional $5 a month, generating 120,000 new food-only subscribers. That's built off a base of 3 million other print subscribers, so decent conversion rates. And again, we've got other client examples such as Newsday with their Feed Me brand, doing really well with food-based content. Reviews I touched on earlier, but I believe could be a more powerful revenue generation tool. Commissions was the example I gave, but why publishers can't repackage or create digital-only editions around a certain topic or a theme would seem a logical step as well, especially when you've got brands like TripAdvisor, Trustpilot, and even Which succeeding in the digital space. So, Sean, do we have enough time to be moving on to the subscription drivers and such like?
Yes, we have. We've got a couple of questions coming in, but we've still got a bit of time. So
okay, yeah. Well, I'll go through these then. So this is other things that we found during the research that maybe doesn't align 100% with the webinar topic, but we hope that it's of interest and there's some insight in here. The low initial price point with a future-focused high recurring is the #1 tool that we found used by the foremost digital media brands to get people engaging, paying for content. Examples like the Times, which is £1 for 8 weeks, or New York Times Basic, which is $1 for 4 weeks, gets people into paying for content. Their brain assimilates it with a higher value product. As a publisher, you get the card and the payment credentials on file so that you can start doing the repeat billing, and you've got a certain period of time to lock them in, work them, get your data analytics tools to understand what their preferences are and give them more of what they want. Some publishers also, in addition to that, then have sales or limited time promotions too. So Marca did one recently in Spain with a heavy discount to get people in. Free gifts also help. So Telegraph's Fitbit promotion, magazines time with retailers, regional publishers association promotions for when they sell an annual subscription, getting a contra deal in is a win for everyone. Robot journalism is really interesting. So MIT Media auto creates content from local football team coverage using journalism bots. A manager texts a number of key pieces of content through to MIT, and then MIT uses their other contextual information such as video, such as weather and location, to then create those match reports. And those match reports in turn have been a big driver of new subscriptions. When I first heard it, I sort of despaired because I was like, oh, is that the future of journalism? But actually, if you can harness automation in a way to drive subscriptions, and that then help funds other types of journalism efforts, then I'm all the more for it. Valuation, the value proposition is also key in finding where your sweet spot is from a marketing message perspective. So Wall Street Journal and Financial Times have honed in on the financial markets. Washington Post have honed in on global politics. Guardian, in terms of liberalism and supporting journalism and independent with their independent minds campaigns, have allowed them for the whole business and the marketing and sales efforts to be focused on that key individual marketing message that aligns with the type of content to drive the value proposition. On a product perspective, the most interesting example I found was Le Figaro in France, who have their main paper and then they have 10 completely different supplements, each with a unique price. So in actual fact, the customer's got 10 or 11 different products that they can choose from. I don't know the reasons behind it. I wonder if it's because subscribers are saying, well, I only read 2 or 3 of the supplements alongside the main edition, and therefore, maybe they were looking to leave and not pay anything, and the Figaro made a decision that because they produce so many supplements, the best thing to do would be to allow people to actually pick and choose. One to dig into. Opening up your products is important. Loads of our US publishers do this really successfully when bad weather strikes and the print paper can't, or the magazine can't get to people's households. I'm sure from memory, Boston Globe have done it in the deep freeze in the winter. The best example we've heard of is GFR in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Who the country was hit by a terrible hurricane, devastated the communities, and GFR distributed the print product and the digital product completely for free for a number of weeks, just so that people got that information, that daily touch point with what was happening. They took the financial hit. Obviously, that would have impacted them in terms of cash flow as well. But the benefit has been that the community has since rallied round in terms of recovering from the hurricane, but also rallied around the paper and to sort of honour and pay tribute to the fact that GFR did a relatively noble thing. They've seen subscriptions come back around, and advertisers stick with them as well. So that's a really good positive news story for the newspaper industry about opening up your product. The cross-title concept is interesting. It's happened a few times, but the most prolific is definitely the Washington Post. We've cited the Telegraph there. They also do it with big papers in Poland, and I actually found that they're now giving complimentary access in partnership to over 250 papers all across the world, although I'd imagine none in the States because they don't want to cannibalize their own audience. But that's a really interesting way in which they're obviously trying to promote themselves as a global brand, in the same way that New York Times has moved beyond New York, and now they have promoted themselves as a global news brand. And Washington Post obviously following a similar suit. Or is it, and I wouldn't put it past him, a play by Bezos to get more contextual information on other countries and other subscribers that then complain to one of his other businesses? Who knows? Gifting has always been very, very popular with magazines in terms of driving direct subscriptions. I think one thing that we've seen in the States is that other publishers could learn from, and indeed publishers in the States, some subscribers have got such high wealth and such levels of disposable income that they almost dwarf the highest the bigger percentage numbers of the other readership. And is there a way that publishers can tap into that, can work with local benefactors, work with wealthy local people to help sustain the future of journalism, where if you can afford to pay more, you will pay more, and maybe the PR or the CSR benefits from that are the businesses who can support that, from universities or young college kids or just poorer demographics, get that feeling as well. Newsletters have been really important. So New York Times have actually cut the number of newsletters down, but have found that it's still by a ratio of 2 to 1 drives the propensity to subscribe if somebody is engaged with a newsletter. Les Echos and New Yorker have also seen that there's a direct correlation with people who've either subscribed or utilized newsletters with their strongest level of subscriptions. We actually see the strongest e-paper and on new edition product traction coming through newsletters as well, because it's that daily touch point that then obviously subscribers can instantly tap into. Okay, spin-off brands, some good examples: The Economist Espresso, The Week and National Geographic moving into children's markets with their kids branded products. You can either buy it on its own, or you can have it as a bundle with the adults version, which makes sense. I know I've done that on a recent holiday, bought that at the airport. I read one, the kids read the other. You feel like you're getting a decent value deal as well because it's in the bundle. That's a clever way to target different demographics. On the free trial perspective, obviously publishers, by utilizing a CRM, can actually go from tracking previously anonymous users into tracked and tagged users. So by people signing up for a free trial but maybe giving an email address, then over time giving more data credentials away, it creates a really big bucket for potential subscribers who can then track what you're reading. So if I'm reading sports stories over a number of weeks, the publisher then sends me a personalized email about that sports coverage to help drive the propensity to buy. Other important examples include McClatchy in the States, in big cities like Miami, who've potentially got big sports-only subscription contingents, who really engage with the commentary and the insight from journalists and sports stars. They're trying to tap into that by offering sports-only subscriptions. We've seen from newsletters and our own e-paper that a huge percentage of people jump straight into their specific section, and sports being one. Newsday even shows their back page, which is almost like the sports front page, so that people can tap into it instantaneously. On a new audience signaling perspective, Wall Street Journal uses 60 signals, New York Times uses 40 signals, all of which in their CRM identifies somebody's propensity to buy or not. There are some really obvious ones that everyone could take heed from. So whether people are on a certain operating system, with iOS being the highest propensity to buy, are they on a specific device, with a tablet user being the highest propensity to buy? Has somebody created an e-wallet? Again, that's one of the highest propensities to buy. So if you can tick that, having a card and payment registered, and you're coming from a certain type of device, you're really going to be pushing those subscriber levels forwards. And if you think about it, that's the reason why iTunes is so popular, because it's just a simple one-click payment with all of that type of data stored. From a print perspective, so many innovations still happening, which is great. You've got, even just here in the UK, you've got Newsquest with monthly magazines, Archer with the New European a couple of years ago. Even Facebook launched a new print product. Again, to mention INMA, and again to mention Newsday, that I think they actually came second at the awards this year for their print product, for their Feed Me. And that's great. It's a fantastic print product, but from our perspective as well as a digital publisher, it's really nice to see that they're harnessing it too. They're inputting videos, and really then the print is just part of a nice media mix. And that's the way that all of these channels or distribution models should be viewed. It's not one or the other. It's all combined, part of a media mix, and essentially delivering content in whatever form people want as part of that community pitch. Gamification. So there's been some recent interest in this. I referenced puzzles and crosswords earlier, which are always popular in print and digital, but the more interactive elements are certainly generating interest, and publishers potentially could do something to explore that. We found the Telegraph had successfully used Snapchat in driving attention to the 18 to 24-year-old demographic, and that was actually one of their fastest growth markets for audience. The FT is using WhatsApp, and you can actually get one free article a day if you're subscribed. No, not subscribed. If you just have the FT WhatsApp channel, so you get that completely for free. And they're using that obviously as a way to try and build brand awareness and engagement, so that new audiences, maybe mobile first audiences, start interacting with that content more. The final example I've put here is Daily Mail on LinkedIn. I'm not talking about Oleg and the CTO who's constantly on there, but I have seen a lot of political and health coverage gaining traction that they post. And as someone, this is anecdotal, but as someone who follows pretty much every publisher going across the earth, I think it's really underutilized from publishers' perspective, because the amount of sales material on LinkedIn, actually the quality content that publishers produce, the audience is there. And the reason I cite Daily Mail is because they seem to post relatively frequently and get high engagement on it. Okay, so I think that is...
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. I think that's about all we've got time for today. Plenty of food for thought there. We've got a couple of questions coming in though, so I'm just going to fire those at you and just pull those up.
Okay.
So first question here, it's an interesting one. What can smaller regional brands do to start to diversify their revenues?
I think it's, identifying 4 or 5 additional revenue opportunities and testing those out outside of subscriptions and advertising. So if trialing off events, trying something in the audio space, maybe having a look at what other brands are in their market that they might want to invest in. Are there any vertical or horizontal integrations? I know on the venture capital investment side of things, that's probably why they're asking about the smaller side. It was all about the big brands, but even regionals could invest in those as well.
Yeah, I think there's plenty, depending on your niche, isn't it, to get involved in, to diversify those revenues. Okay, so next question. Can you start a new brand without committing too much time or resource?
Yes, definitely. And that's one of the areas that I think plays into publishers' hands with the archive and depth of content that publishers already have, whether that's in print or digital. You can digitize that, and you can create digital only if that's part of the question. The new brand could be print, but I'm assuming it's digital without to. Yeah, you've got the content there. There are platforms like ours where you can take previously print content, XML content, video, all sorts, and bundle it up, package it.
That content, isn't it? Especially like the classic archive editions we're seeing. I think they're working really well, repackaging that content from historic events, for example.
Yeah, definitely. And that there's a really great example, and that's been really successful.
Yeah. Okay, so one more question here. So why do you think publishers are having so much success with newsletters?
I think because it's that daily touch point for like we were talking a little bit about the other day with push notifications, but newsletters obviously direct to people's inbox. Most publishers have got it down to a fine art where it's at a certain time of day. There's the opportunity to maybe put the sections in, maybe put specific or personalization elements in it as well. I think it's also going to be important in the evolution of the HTML5 products that we have as well. So they're still and apps are still the most highly engaged with product, but with newsletters being important, that typically is a web-based product. I think the links through to Edition with the HTML5 Edition products are going to be really important going forwards as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ben. So that's all the questions we have today. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate that. Any final words, Ben?
Jess, thank you for joining us. I hope the additional bits at the end haven't killed your afternoon or your morning. Obviously, as Sean said, we'll be sending this out. And if you've got any further questions that you want to ask after this, you can call or email your account manager. You can speak to me directly. We've actually